This is Teachers Talk Radio, and you are listening live.
Today on the Saturday Morning Breakfast Show, we are once again talking about leadership. We are decoding it, we are thinking about its nature, and we are thinking about whether what is currently in education is fit for education.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and you are listening live. Tune in live at ttradio.org, or to join in the conversation, download the Podbean app and search Teachers Talk Radio. Follow the hashtag TTRadio. Tune in, talk it out with Teachers Talk Radio.
A very good morning to you. It is Saturday, the 24th of August, 2024. It is 9 a.m. and this is your Saturday breakfast show with me, Darren Lester. I am, as always, very grateful to have you here to share breakfast with me. On a Saturday, we are always happy to spend the morning together to be chatting all things education. It is one of my favourite types of days today. It is grey, it is drizzly, it is feeling like autumn is on the way, and I am ready for it. I am not going to lie. I talked last week about how this is my favourite part of summer, the kind of end of summer where it's not as hot as it has been. It is a much mellower type of light. We are making that transition into the autumn time, and this morning is no exception. I must admit, I am enjoying it very, very much. It has been a very productive week here for those of us in the Saturday Breakfast Show family. I've managed to get quite a lot done personally in terms of preparing for September, preparing for the new school year, thinking about my new role, of course, as a head of department, which, like I've said before, I have been already in not the school that I've just left, but the school before. I was head of languages, but I was the only person in that department. So I was kind of head of languages by default, really. And kind of thinking about my new role, thinking about kind of what it means to be a department lead has had me once again thinking about leadership. Now, we've talked about leadership relatively often here on Saturday Morning Breakfast over the past, 18 months or so. Kind of since I started my leadership module at university as part of my doctorate in education, we've been talking about it because it's not something that I ever saw in my career path. I was quite happy to kind of bumble along as a classroom teacher. But then kind of as I've learned more about educational leadership, about the nature of educational leadership, I've become more interested theoretically in it. I still don't think I want to progress any higher than a department head, but it is interesting to think about. And so that's what we're going to do with our morning this morning. We're going to think about how and why leadership has been defined in different ways. We're going to think about the differences between leadership and management and how sometimes we can get a bit caught up in the language that we are using. We are going to think about why it can be difficult to assess the efficacy of leadership. We're going to think about how we can describe leadership as individualistic, as dyadic, as group, or as organizational. We're going to think about how leadership has been defined at different points in time. So we're going to touch on all sorts of different things today. This does, of course, build on, like I've said, the kind of inadvertent mini-series that we have done on leadership here at Saturday Morning Breakfast. So please do, if you've not listened to my previous episodes on leadership already, please do go back and listen to those. I always try and do a whole bunch of research informing Saturday Morning Breakfast. I'm very much a research-led practitioner, and I appreciate the excuse to do some reading to be able to come and talk to you all about this stuff. So yeah, please do, if you are an aspiring leader, if you are a new leader like I am, if you are not a leader but the topic just interests you, then please do go back and have a listen at some of those past episodes. We will get to that. We will get to our topic very, very soon. But first, let's see what has been going on in the week with the news.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. Happy reading.
Get set for the year ahead with the Bloomsbury Education Back to School sale. Save 30% on all Bloomsbury education books until 30th September. From the very best in research-led practice to trusted advice on inclusivity, behaviour and curriculum design, we've got something for everyone. Visit bloomsbury.com/B2S sale to shop now and save 30%. Bloomsbury Education, books for every step of your teaching journey.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and this is Teachers Talk Radio News.
Media outlets across England, Wales and Northern Ireland have covered GCSE and other Level 2 results in detail. Many stories highlighted the fact that Year 11 pupils receiving results this summer started Year 7 in September 2019, but were in lockdown before the first year of secondary school had ended, with the BBC describing the cohort as unique. Many stories focused on the GCSE pass rate, which has fallen for a third year running, back in line with 2019 levels. The drop was steepest in Northern Ireland, followed by Wales. In England, the plan was to bring grades back in line last year, but they remained a little higher. The regional divide continues to grow in England. London continues to be the highest performing region, with 72.5% of entries marked at grade 4 or above, compared to the 63.1% in the West Midlands. The gap is up from 8.7 last year to 9.4 percentage points. It seems the pre-COVID north-south divide is continuing. 4 out of 5 regions in the North and Midlands had a lower pass rate this year than in 2019. But in every region in the south it has risen. Many have commented that long-term disadvantages within some regions are to blame. MPs warned last year that it could take a decade for the gap between disadvantaged pupils and others to narrow to pre-pandemic levels. Resits are also set to rise for both English language and maths. This is because the pass rate is slightly worse, but the 16-year-old population has grown since the pandemic, so more places on courses to resit will be needed. Colleges have previously said they had increased class sizes due to population growth and grade boundary changes, but will now need to prepare for even more. This has prompted some to question whether the compulsory resit approach is still appropriate. Full details of the results analysis can be found on the BBC, TES and other education news websites. In Australia, the right to disconnect is coming into force. It gives employees the power to not respond to out-of-hours contact from their employer without suffering consequences. This has prompted some to consider the impact this could have on schools. While some legitimate out-of-hours activities have to take place, residential trips, visits and sport, etc., Teacher unions have argued that staff should not be permanently on call. They have particularly focused on parent and student contact with teachers, especially via email, and the expected response times, which should be in place in order to protect work-life balance. The news from Australia has prompted fresh debate on social media regarding workload for teachers in many countries, use of emails, and the recruitment and retention crisis in the UK. The Guardian focuses on the story of a group of trainee female doctors from Afghanistan who have travelled to Edinburgh to complete their medical degrees after the Taliban forced them to quit. The 19 women arrived in the UK last week after a 3-year campaign by the parents of Linda Norgrove, the kidnapped Scottish charity worker who was killed during a rescue attempt by US Special Forces in 2010. A foundation set up by her parents worked with UK and Scottish officials to arrange safe passage and student visas. They have been given places at 4 medical schools after Scottish ministers changed the law to treat them as home students, eligible for free tuition. One of the women arriving said, "Our journey here will be long, 8 or 9 years. I think during this time many alterations and changes will come to Afghanistan. I am hopeful the situation won't remain the same." Finally, a primary school in Orkney has welcomed a new, unusual intake of pupils. According to the story on the BBC News website, the new class is made up entirely of boys. The rare occurrence is a first for the P1 class teachers, but the situation doesn't seem to bother the boys themselves, with one of the 18 saying the class was good without girls. The school is making sure that the boys will still have the opportunity to interact with girls outside the classroom, but that the boys-only class was really special and something they're going to remember forever. This has been your Teachers Talk Radio News with Joe Fox.
So I've just realised that I've been chatting to you here since the news ended, and I hadn't actually pushed the button to unmute myself. So I think that's just going to set the tone for us for today, but that's all right. I was saying that that it's quite an interesting indicator of how times have changed, isn't it? That Joe is reporting there on the single-sex class on the Orkney Isles being something that is newsworthy, something that is unique, something that the boys will remember forever. But up until comparatively recently, it was normal. You know, single-sex classes were how children were educated. I walk quite regularly past the building in which I went to playgroup, and that was the old Victorian school. And it still has the stone entryways labelled boys and girls, so that the boys had their entrance to go into their classroom, the girls had their entrance to go into their classroom, and they wouldn't have mixed. And in so many countries, the idea of whether or not single-sex education is the best way to educate children is still in debate. Even in this country, we have certain schools that are single-sex. The grammar school that is closest to me is split in two. There is a boys' school and there's a girls' school, and for a little while they merged for sixth form, but now the sixth form has split again. Although I think it's still mixed. So yeah, I think it's quite interesting that in such a short amount of time we can think of single-sex education as being this interesting experiment, when in fact not that long ago it was the norm. And this is something that we see, don't we, all the time in education. These cyclical fads, these cyclical ideas. And I understand that that what Joe was reporting on there is just happenstance, which does make it quite interesting. But it just shows that everything kind of comes back round again. In fact, I remember thinking about it, that my GCSE English class was just boys. They explained it to us. I don't know why they did it. And kind of even now with my teacher head on, I can't quite figure out why they did it. But they explained to us that they took what would have been the top set, but realistically it had to have been the top two sets. And they kind of split us. So there was a boys class top set English and a girls class top set English. And they said that they wanted to see whether it would have any impact on our results. Whether or not that was the reason, I don't know, but that's what we were told. And I don't know whether it did have any impact on our results. I know that the school has not kept up that tradition in the 20 however many years it's been since I did my GCSE, so maybe it didn't impact too much. But yeah, the idea of what is better when it comes to mixing in education is quite interesting, and would actually be an interesting show. I need to jot that down in my TTR notebook as something that maybe we talk about again in future. I also think this week's news poses an interesting question about SATs. So a big deal has been made again, as Joe mentioned there in the news, about how this year's Year 11 cohort were the ones who were in Year 7 when we went through our first bout of lockdowns, Year 8 when we went through our second here in England, and the impact that might have had on their GCSE results. So to me, that suggests that we are accepting that GCSEs are a 5-year term of study, at least, which, you know, I do believe, particularly in languages, which as long-term friends of the show will know is my domain. The stuff that we teach in Year 7 is absolutely going to come up, you know, days of the week, months of the year, numbers, all of that foundational language will absolutely come up on the GCSE. So if we are accepting that these are 5-year courses, because that's the only reason that we might suggest that the pandemic has had an impact on GCSE results this year, why do we still have Key Stage 3 SATs in Year 9? Why do we then have this kind of scheme within a scheme, as it were, to assess the children at this kind of arbitrary point? It seems to me that if we are accepting right now that GCSEs are 5-year schemes, we should treat them that way. And our children should just go through their education and sit their GCSE exams when they are in Year 11. I don't really see the need for this kind of midpoint assessment, this midpoint sitting. But I'm just a teacher. What do I know? We are talking today about leadership on the show. I'm calling this one Decoding Leadership, because leadership can sometimes be a bit of a mystery, even to those in positions of leadership, I think, because different people have different opinions on what it means to lead. Different people have different opinions on what it means to be led, and they can come into conflict, which I think is why leaders quite often get a bad time of it, because they lead in the way that they think is best. They lead in the way that they were taught to lead if they had any leadership training, and the lack of leadership training is something that is an issue. But of course, when you are leading people, you've got to make sure that you are sensitive to those individual needs, that you are understanding of what your people want, of how you can help your people develop. And so it becomes very, very difficult. And this is on top of the challenge that leaders face, particularly school leaders. There is, quite frankly, not enough money in the world that you could pay me to be a head teacher. because there is just so much stress and so much pressure that comes with that job. It is absolutely not for me. And I recognize that. And I think that's one of the reasons that leadership has become an interest of mine, as somebody who is quite ambitious and who does like to succeed in his career. And I said this on the show before, I do find it frustrating that there is no, in inverted commas, success in the education profession. There is no progression in the education profession without moving into leadership. That is what our career progression is supposed to look like. And so it means that, you know, when I'm 39 and I've now hit what is in theory my career progression cap, because I actually don't want to go any further up the ladder than being a head of department, it means that I've got like 30 more years, because let's be realistic, I'm not going to get to retire, of no progression, which I find very frustrating. Very frustrating. So we're gonna decode leadership today. We're going to pick it apart a little bit. We are going to have a think about what it actually entails. If you have any comments, if you want to join in with the show today, please do. I am always here to hear what you have to say. If you are listening live through the Podbean app, good morning to you. You can text in. You have the option, you have the facility right there in the app to let me know your thoughts on what we are talking about today. I will read them out live on air. If you just want to share your thoughts with me but don't particularly want them broadcast, then just let me know in the message. That's absolutely fine. But generally, I will read and respond. If you are listening to this live but you are not in the Podbean app, you are in one of the many places that TTR shows can be accessed, or if you are not listening live, if you are listening back in your own time, as I know many people do. Thank you to all of you who have texted and tweeted to let me know that that you listen on playback. I appreciate you very, very much. You can tweet me. I am at Mr. D Lester. That's MRDLESTER, all one word. I will, if they are coming through live while I'm here in the studio, I will read them out. Again, let me know if you don't want me to. But otherwise, I will read them out and engage that way. I've got Twitter open in a tab here. Or if you are not listening live, like I said, if you are in the future, you can still tweet me and I will still engage. We can still have that conversation because I will always, always find these things interesting. So we're going to start with one of my favorite, no, not one of, we're going to start with my favorite quote about leadership. And it's from Lao Tzu. And Lao Tzu said, "A leader is best when people hardly know that they exist. A leader is not so good when people obey and acclaim them. And a leader is at their worst when they are despised. But of a good leader who talks very little, when his task is done and aim fulfilled, the people he leads will say, 'We did it ourselves.'" And I love that quote. I love that quote. And if I think about the people in my career who I have looked up to as leaders, who I have respected as leaders, one jumps out in particular, and he said almost exactly the same thing. The exams officer in my previous school, his office was right next to our department, so he would often come in and chat. And, you know, we know that being an exams officer is a big thing. For those of you who are not teachers, because I know that that not everybody who listens in on a Saturday morning is a teacher, or for those of you who perhaps have not done any secondary teaching or been in a secondary school since your own school days. The exams officer is the person who is responsible for organising the exams. So they and their team will make all of the entries for GCSEs and for A-levels. They will run all of the ALICE testing, for example, all of the CAT testing. Basically, if there is any kind of exam, even down to, the year 7 end of year exams, it will be the exam officer and their team organizing that, running that, making sure it goes so smoothly. And it is a huge job. It is a huge job. So I tip my hat this morning to all exams officers, particularly as you now go through the unenviable job of sorting out certificates and doing all of that admin that quite often people forget needs to be done. But the exams officer in my previous school, he would often come and chat, and we would talk about how difficult his job was, and I would talk about how difficult his job was. I was always in awe of how organized he had to be. And he once said, exactly the same thing as Lao Tzu did there. He said, if I've done my job properly, then it's as if I haven't done anything at all. And I really respect that, and I really take that on board, because for me, the job of a leader is to facilitate. It is to make the lives of everybody who is under them, everybody in their team, much, much easier. And if they are facilitating, then that means that they are predicting issues, solving them before they become an issue, protecting their team from anything that is an issue outside and solving it themselves. It's very much a job of watching, I suppose, watching and preempting. So I like this idea of a leader being somebody that operates almost unseen, somebody who operates behind the scenes, somebody who doesn't need to be constantly lauded and praised and told how great they are. Somebody who isn't constantly telling everybody else how great they are because they're the leader, but somebody who does just kind of fade into the shadows, I suppose, and let the people under them really shine. But what's interesting, and I've discussed this on the show before, is this idea that anyone can be a leader. And it's something that I understand. It's something that I recognize in theory, although it's not something that I agree should be the case. So a definition of leadership, because there are all sorts of definitions, but a definition of leadership is any person who influences individuals and groups inside an organization, who helps them to establish their goals, and who guides them towards achieving their goals, which allows them to be effective. So first of all, within our classrooms, we are all leaders, because we do those things for our children. Those of you who are not teachers, but work with children, you are also leaders of the children with whom you work, because you are influencing them, you are guiding them, you are helping to show them what is possible. And this is one of the reasons why I think leadership studies for everybody are quite important, because we can all be leaders if we want to. And sometimes even if we don't want to, sometimes we just find ourselves falling into that role inadvertently. But the problem in an organization is when formal leadership comes with a pay bump and remission for so that you've got time to work on these things. When being a leader comes with perks, it's not really appropriate to say, oh, well, everyone can be a leader. because unless everyone is getting those perks, what you're then doing is just exploiting uncompensated labor. So while I do agree, I've just noticed a massive spider in the studio. That's nice. I might have to play Gaverets again in a minute so that I can move out. So while I do agree that anyone can be a leader, I'm not sure that, particularly in the leadership and management structures of school at the moment, we should assume that everybody is a leader. That not everybody wants to be seen as a leader because they are not getting those same benefits. And I think perhaps this is where we need to make a distinction between leadership and management. Because again, in education, we'll talk about this a little bit later on, but in education generally, the two terms are kind of used interchangeably: educational leadership, educational management, senior leadership team, senior management team. But I think they can only be interchangeable if you don't assume that anyone can be a leader. They can only be interchangeable if leadership means management. And I think if you are saying to your classroom teachers, to your ones who don't get any kind of TLR allowance, you are also a leader, then you remove the right to use those terms interchangeably, and you then have to have a senior management team, and your middle leaders, your heads of department, have to become middle management in order for it not to seem like you are exploiting those people who are unpaid, unassigned leaders. The key elements that crop up when you look at all of these different definitions of leadership are that it is a group phenomenon. Leaders are those who have influence and who guide, and leadership involves some form of hierarchy. It kind of has to, doesn't it? You know, the word leader implies somebody at the front and other people following. And this is something else that I've always found quite interesting about leadership. Particularly when we tackle it in school, particularly when we think about it with our children, because we always look for leadership opportunities for our children. You know, we look for heads of houses, we look for sports captains, whatever it might be. And we train children how to be good leaders. But I'm not sure we often train them in how to be good followers. I'm not sure that we think very much, very critically, very effectively about following skills, about the fact that not everybody can be a leader. Not everybody is cut out to be a leader. And even if you are cut out to be a leader, and even if you want to be a leader, in most situations in life, you're not, and you're not going to be. And so I think sometimes when we are teaching our children, we get so caught up in this idea of leadership, we forget that if everybody is leading, there will be nobody to follow. And I think it's very useful for our kids, and, let's be honest, for a lot of adults, to take training in followership skills, in how you can be supportive to your leader. Because, again, not everybody is going to lead. And I think we do those followers a disservice if we don't recognize that. So yeah, leadership is defined by the fact that there is this group, there is this hierarchy, because if it's just you on your own, then there is no one to lead. But because leadership is relational, because it's transactional, you need to think about efficacy in terms of response to other people. Leaders are effective when their followers achieve their goals, when their followers can function well together, when their followers can adapt to the changing demand of external forces. And this perhaps is another reason why a leadership management distinction is necessary, because leadership has to be defined by how the people underneath the leader, how the followers succeed. Because that's the point of the leader. The point of the leader is to take their followers forward. And I think as a leader, that can be really difficult. I've spoken before on the show about how I don't believe that teachers should be judged on the exam results of their classes. I am against performance-related pay. I am against teachers saying, oh, my results were excellent this year. Unless you took an exam, in which case, yes, tell me about how great your results were. But if your class took an exam, then no, I don't believe they're your results. I believe they are your class's results. But I think, when your efficacy is judged by the efficacy of other people, that can be really difficult because of the number of variables in there. The reason that I don't think I, as a teacher, should be judged on my class's exam results is because I do at most 50% of the transaction. I do the teaching part of teaching and learning. If I've taught my course, but my students haven't done the requisite revision, I don't think that should be on me. In the same way that if I've taught the course, but my students have gone above and beyond in the amount of revision that they have done, that's also not on me. And there are going to be people who want to talk about how you should be an inspiring teacher, about how you should make them want to go off and spend all of their time reading Sartre when they are, 12 and all of that sort of thing. But realistically, it is down to them. And it's the same when you have followers. It's the same when you are in a leadership position. A lot of what will be your outcomes are actually down to the people who are following you. And so I think if you are the type of person who likes very rigid tick box, a tick box matrix by which to establish your own efficacy, I think leadership can be really difficult, because I think it can be really hard to know how you're doing and to accurately judge how effective you are if you are based solely on the performance of somebody else. But ultimately, this is what leadership is. Leadership is effective. Leaders are effective when the group achieves its goals. So I suppose a leader has to be responsible for outlining what those goals are, making sure that those goals are communicated properly, make sure that those goals are common. Leaders are effective when the internal processes are smooth. Again, I've done my job properly if it looks like I haven't done anything at all, because everything has just gone very, very smoothly. And leaders are effective when the group can adapt to external forces. So when a new head teacher comes in, your department isn't rocked because you can adapt to that. You as the head of department, you as the teacher who has been designated a leader because the other staff look up to you, you can help to facilitate that transition. But is there a difference between efficacy and success? Is there a difference between being an effective leader and being a successful leader? Because I think if you establish a difference, I personally think there's a difference, but I think if you establish a difference, then that can help with the whole, how do I know if I'm being effective? How do I know if I'm succeeding if my success is based around other people? And I think there is a difference. And for me, it comes down to the locus of the focus, I suppose. To judge efficacy, and I think, to be fair, this doesn't just apply to leadership. I think this can apply across the board. I think to judge efficacy, how effective you are as a leader, you are looking at the people that you are leading. So to be an effective leader, you should make sure that your followers are happy. You should ensure that your followers are productive. You should ensure that there is good communication. You should actively manage conflict. You should motivate. You should train. You should develop the people underneath you. I think that's effective. I think that's being good at your job. I think success, though, is more personal. It's more internal. And I think quite often, if we look at people that we consider to be successful leaders, they have been promoted very quickly. Now, this is interesting. I don't know if anybody saw this, but there was a thread on Twitter a couple of weeks ago about somebody who was claiming to have just finished NQT2 and to then have been given a promotion, to have been given a deputy headship, I think it was. And there was a very negative reaction to that, because people were saying, oh, it's too quick. You know, I hope this isn't real because you're not ready. And I think sometimes quick promotion can engender very negative feelings. So I think sometimes we've got to be very, very careful when we look at promotion and when we think about promotion. But if we are thinking about efficacy, then quick promotion, this idea of somebody being promoted very, very quickly, somebody moving up the ladder very, very quickly, it is one, it is there, it is something that we think about. Successful managers will quite often focus on the network. So, you know, your successful leaders will be the ones who are all over LinkedIn, because they know that by being all over LinkedIn, they can meet other people, they can kind of facilitate their own movement through the, or up the ladder, I suppose, and into whatever is coming next. They interact with people outside of their organization. And they do this because they know that people outside of their organization can facilitate their own incoming, can facilitate their own progression. They can just make that much, much easier. They will socialize, because quite often it is through socialization that different things can occur. So we learned this in at uni. Excuse me, at uni we oh, excuse me. My breakfast, I think, is getting caught in my throat there. We learned this at uni, where we thought about how the old boys clubs, for example, how they functioned. And they functioned very much by being together socially, by going down the pub, by sitting in the smoking room, whatever it might have been. And if you were part of that, if you were part of that in-group, part of that clique, then you were able to get your promotion, essentially, because through that clique, you made connections, you spoke to people, you were able to do what needed to be done in order to get your job, in order to get your promotion. You made those connections. And, it's like the old adage goes, it's not what you know, it's who you know. And sometimes that is sadly true, that it is more about the connections you make than your own competency. So, yeah, I always think that's quite interesting. And finally, successful managers are often active in office politics. So a successful manager, a successful leader won't just manage the conflict, but they will be aware of all of the intricacies surrounding it, for good or for ill. That's a bit of a variable. So, like I said, for me, that difference between efficacy and success does come down to the focus. I think efficacy is focused on you as an individual. No, I don't. I've got that around the wrong way. I'm sorry. I think efficacy is focused on the people around you, focused on people outside of you, focused on your team, while success is more focused on you and your own quick progression.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. Happy reading.
Get set for the year ahead with the Bloomsbury Education Back to School sale. Save 30% on all Bloomsbury education books until 30th September. From the very best in research-led practice to trusted advice on inclusivity, behaviour and curriculum design, we've got something for everyone. Visit bloomsbury.com/B2S sale to shop now and save 30%. Bloomsbury Education, books for every step of your teaching journey.
So let's think about culture for a second. Let's think about workplace culture. Let's think about department culture, whatever it might be. Because it is the leader, the manager, however we want to define them today, that kind of creates the culture of a workplace. Because if, as we've discussed, it is the responsibility of an effective leader to make sure that the followers are satisfied, to make sure that they are productive, to make sure that people are communicating, to make sure that conflict is managed, to make sure that people are motivated, then they have got to be the ones who are leading that. They've got to be the ones who are driving that forward. So I've been looking at Hofstede's individualism versus collectivism when it comes to culture. And I find this really interesting because collectivist cultures will self-define as being dependent on the in-group. So a collectivist culture is very much defined by the people who are designated the leaders, self-designated or otherwise. The goals of the group are given priority over the goals of the individual. Social norms determine social behavior. Relationships within the collectivist group are built on communal terms. You keep the people that you are friendly with, the people that you have a lot in common with, close to you, and you keep the people that you do not have a lot in common with, you keep the people who actively work against you far from you. And it's okay to be dishonest to people outside of your group, of your collective, in order to protect the well-being of the collective. So a collectivist culture is very much one where the group is treated as an organism, I suppose, where the group is treated as one thing that needs to protect itself. In an individualistic culture, you've got this idea that self is autonomous from the group, where your personal goals are given priority over that of the collective, where attitudes determine social behavior, where relationships are quite often transactional rather than friendship-based, and where other people, regardless of how you feel about them, are outside of your circle. They are removed from your sense of self. So an individualistic culture within a workplace very much prioritizes the individual, the self, the progression of each individual member. And I think sometimes it can be really hard to juggle those two things, particularly if you are not clear on what the culture of your department, of your school, of your classroom is. Because if, for example, you are trying to run a collectivist department, where it is the running of the department that is important, where it is the success of the department that is the priority, but you have somebody who comes in and is individualistic in their outlook. Maybe they're very ambitious, they want to climb the ladder very quickly, they see their job in your department as a stepping stone to their next job, then there's going to be a mismatch there between priorities. And that's going to cause a lot of unhappiness. That's going to cause a lot of upheaval if it's not managed properly. And this is why I think the interview process is really, really important. Quick plug, I did a case study a few months ago where I was interviewing for all kinds of different jobs, including the one that I've now moved into. And I kind of recorded and reflected on my experiences of that week. So if you haven't listened to that one yet, but you are interested in interview processes, please do go back and listen to that, because I know a lot of people have found it helpful. I've got some really positive feedback on that one. But I think during the interview process, it is important for the employer, the school, to be honest about what the culture of the school is. They shouldn't tell a prospective candidate what they want the culture to be. They should tell the candidate what the culture actually is, so that they can check that everything aligns. Because I think quite often conflict in departments arises when these expectations are mismatched. What's interesting, though, is that beyond individualism and collectivism, Hofstadter talks about horizontal and vertical alignment. So not only could you be a collectivist or an individualist, but you could be a vertical collectivist or a horizontal collectivist, or you could be a vertical individualist or a horizontal individualist. If you are a horizontal person, you prioritize equality. If you are a vertical person, you prioritize hierarchy. So that's quite clear. That's quite clear in the imagery. So if you are a vertical collectivist, then you are very considerate of rank and status amongst members of the collective. You are obedient to authority, and you are willing to sacrifice yourself, your own goals, your own needs for the good of the collective, for the good of the people above you. And I talk about this, you as an individual, but actually the philosophy of your department could be vertical collectivist, where you as the leader choose to prioritize rank and status amongst members, the obedience to authority, the sacrifice of self. And I think sometimes you can do these things without being aware of it. And I think self-awareness is very important for leaders, which is why I think this kind of reading, this kind of research is really important, so that you know what your alignment is, so that you know what you are doing consciously and subconsciously, so that you can get the best out of your team. If you are a horizontal collectivist, you believe that all members are equal, that there is no hierarchy, and that everything should be driven by consensus. And I think that can be really difficult, because as I've alluded to before, yes, we can say that anybody can be a leader, that anybody within an organization can be a leader within that organization. But if leadership roles, if management roles, I'm using these terms interchangeably right now, if they come with a pay bump, if they come with non-contact time, if they come with perks, then that creates a hierarchy. Because what that is saying is this person's leadership is more important than this person's. This person's leadership deserves reward more than this person's leadership. So I think realistically, the only way that there can be a horizontal collectivist regime within a department, within a school, is if there were to be no TLR, if there were no perks for leadership whatsoever. Or alternatively, if everybody got perks for leadership, which then kind of meant that nobody had them because that was no longer a perk, that was standard. But horizontal collectivism requires complete equality, which doesn't fit with the business stylings that educational leadership has right now. If we then look at the individualists, vertical individualists see certain people as unique and superior to others. So your vertical individualist is the one who very much prizes rank, who very much prizes the concept of authority, and will probably strive for that. Your horizontal individualist, let's get that emphasis correct, will consider the individual to be unique, but not superior to everybody else. So you've then got this idea that everybody in your department has their own agenda. Everybody in your department has their own ideas. Everybody in your department brings something to the table, but that you've got that equality in there. So I think what's interesting about the vertical and horizontal alignments is actually how difficult it is in education to be a horizontalist. Because by its nature, by the nature of there being TLR, by the nature of heads of department having remission, senior leaders having X, Y, and Z, even just down to little things like people going out for lunch together. Once there start being perks and rewards for being a leader, you kind of no longer have that horizontalism. And I don't know if anybody is going to want to be an educational leader if it doesn't come with some kind of perk or reward. And I think this is, again, where the fact that in education we have taken a business style of management and just kind of forced it onto education. I think that's where we've done ourselves a disservice. And up until I was doing the research for this show, I always thought that was a little bit sad. I thought, isn't it awful that we've had this thrust upon us, that we've had this business structure of leadership applied to education, that we've been forced into this box that we don't fit. But then as I was doing my research for today's show, I realized that actually this is a choice that we've made. We've decided that we're going to run education like we run business. And every school year, every academic year that starts where we haven't attempted to change this, we've decided that again. So I kind of don't feel sorry for us anymore. I did. I used to feel sorry for the fact that we've got this kind of educational leadership style that doesn't really work for education because it wasn't designed for education. And I thought, oh, isn't it sad that no one is designing something for us? But I don't feel that way anymore, because now I think actually we are choosing not to change it. We are choosing not to do the research into it. We're choosing to just carry on with the status quo. Because sometimes not making a choice is making a choice. So that's a little rant that I didn't mean to go off on. But leadership is difficult. Leadership, management, it is hard. And there are very specific obstacles that can stand in the way. And that specifically stand in the way of efficacy. So again, we're continuing with this distinction between efficacy and success, because they're not always the same thing. Obstacles to efficacy can include environmental uncertainty. If you don't know how long your department is still going to be a department for, because you teach art or music or languages or any of those subjects that are constantly under threat, those subjects are always the first ones to be cut whenever there is some kind of budget constraint, then you can't really be an effective leader, because you've always got that worry at the back of your mind. If you are a leader and half of your staff are moving on, and so, you've got a 50% turnover, you've got 5 new teachers coming in September, you don't know them, you need to get to know them, you need to get to know who they are as people, how they are as people, that can be a barrier to your efficacy, because you have got these extra worries that you are harboring. You've got this extra cognitive load that you are having to deal with. Organizational rigidity can stop leaders being effective. Ironically, because you would think that an organization being rigid would help with efficacy, because it would mean everybody knew exactly where they stood. But actually, if an organization is too rigid in its structures, in its rules, in how it wants departments to be run, then that can cause friction with the head of department, with the leader, if they don't agree. And again, if you have got a head of department who is incredibly rigid in how they want something to be run, but you've got maybe 2 or 3 teachers within that department who have this informal, unpaid leadership role, then there can be friction there between what they think is the best thing to do and what the person who's being paid to lead thinks is best to do. So I think this is where the idea of an effective leader being a good communicator comes into play. Because what you would want is, if you are a very rigid person who is saying, this is how we are doing things from now on, you would want the people underneath you, your followers, to be able to come and say, well, actually, I don't think this works because I've read all of these studies which prove this doesn't work. Please, could we try this instead? And you would want them to feel like they could come and have that conversation with you. Because again, if your efficacy as a leader is being judged by how well your followers are developing, you need them to be comfortable coming to you in order to develop. effective leadership can be thrown off by having a lack of opportunity to practice. If you've got a leader who is a leader in name only, who actually can't make any decisions, they are too constrained perhaps by the school that they're in. If they are the leader of a department and they are the only person in their department, so they are a leader in job title, but not in terms of having anybody to lead. Because as with anything, if you don't practice, you can't do it very well. Practice makes perfect, as they say. And so if you don't have those opportunities, then you are not able to progress, you are not able to succeed. Relying on overly simplistic solutions can be an obstacle. Now, this confused me a little bit when I read the research, because, you know, we know about Occam's razor. We know about how the simplest answer is usually the correct one. The simplest solution is usually the most effective. But actually, if you are just always relying on simple solutions to problems, you are not always solving the problem. Simple solutions quite often will gloss over the problem. They will be like those memes you see of rented houses where the landlord has painted over the cockroach before you move in. So if, as a leader, you are relying on simple solutions all of the time, then you are not getting to the systemic heart of the problem. And I do think this is one of the issues that we have in education, that quite often a lot of what we talk about, a lot of the reforms that we make, are simplistic solutions. And what we need is leadership that will actually get to the root of what the issues are and work on solving them. And finally, in my list of obstacles to effective leadership, I've thought about inaccessible research. Now, this should come as no surprise. Like I've mentioned numerous times on the show, I am currently doing my doctorate in education, and that means reading all kinds of research, and it means doing my own, kind of actively contributing to knowledge is the term they keep giving us. And I think teachers quite often don't engage with research as well as we could. I've talked before on the show, I believe, about how so much of the research that I'm reading as part of my doctorate comes from nursing. And nurses and medical professionals in general, but nurses in particular, seem to be so on top of research-informed practice. But that's not something that we get very often in teaching. You know, we have an overview of the research when we do our initial teacher training. We get people coming in at inset day and telling us about research, and that generally is the extent to which we engage with it, because we don't have time. But I think one of the other reasons, kind of taking the blame away from us a little bit and thinking, again, widely about the systemic problem, is how inaccessible research can be. And for two reasons. First is physically being able to access it. You know, I'm affiliated with my university because I'm doing my degree, and so I get access to all of these different articles and stuff. But before you sign in, it always tells you how much it costs. And there is no teacher that I know of who can afford to pay £35 to read one paper. So, you know, the fact that so much research is kept behind a paywall and that we don't have the funding to be able to access these things is a problem. Now, from the opposite side of that, there is a problem because, of course, researchers need to be paid. That's their job. And quite often, you know, the journals need to be able to publish. And quite often, the only way to do that is to put the research behind a paywall. So there are kind of two conflicting needs here. And I don't know what the answer is. Well, no, actually, I do know what the answer is. We need to improve school budgets so that schools can access educational journals. That's the answer. But it's not going to happen, is it? The other reason that research can quite often be inaccessible is the way that it's written. I very much, as a writer, like to keep things plain. I like to say what I mean, because I think that that's the easiest way to make sure that you are understood. But as we all know from our university days, that's not how academic writing works. And quite often, academic writing can be very dense, it can be very thick, it can be paragraphs and paragraphs where the writer doesn't actually say anything. And that can make it very, very difficult to access, very difficult to understand, very difficult to process. And I think there is an extent of, to which that is gatekeeping. I think there is an extent to which that is academia trying to keep itself a little bit insular. But I think if there are any educational publishers out there listening to the show, I'm willing to work with you on this. I think there is a market for educational research journals that are published in a plain speaking way that everybody can access, that everybody can read quickly. Bite-sized research, as it were. So access to research, access to knowing what the latest thoughts in education are, can be a barrier. That lack of access can be a barrier, because it means that leaders don't always know what is going on within their domain, within their realm. So up until now, I've been using management and leadership fairly interchangeably. We talked a little bit at the beginning about why we shouldn't do that. But I have been. So let's now go back and think about what those differences are. Again, I've touched on this in shows before, but I think if you are going to differentiate between leadership and management, it's really important to know why and to know what you mean. This was a big thing that we talked about in one of the lectures that I had on educational leadership. What this difference is. So leaders tend to be future focused and forward thinking. Leaders attempt to create change. They try to create culture based around shared values. They try to establish an emotional link with followers, and they try to use their own personal power. So leadership is very much forward thinking and interpersonal. Management, on the other hand, tends to be present thinking. Management is about the protection and the perpetuation of the institution as it currently is. Management is about making sure that your school will still be open in September. It focuses on maintaining the status quo because the status quo works. Management is about the implementation of policies and procedure, because again, that can perpetuate the status quo. That can just make sure that everything runs smoothly. Managers have to try and maintain objectivity. Managers cannot be seen to be playing favorites. And I do think sometimes this must be really hard for managers, particularly at secondary, where you will have climbed the ladder, so you will have been a classroom teacher, you will have been a subject teacher at some point, and yet you can't show favoritism towards your subject. If you're a head teacher, it cannot be suggested that you are treating your discipline better than the others. And I think if you are middle or senior management, so you're still teaching, that can also be very different, because you then of course have the interesting dichotomy of being in a position of power but also working alongside the people that you are leading, and I think that must be really, really difficult, and is one of the reasons why I personally would not want to go any higher than I currently am. Tim has texted in, good morning to you. Tim is a long-term friend of the show. I introduce him the same way every single week. He was my very first and second guest, and it's always a pleasure to hear his contributions. He is saying that he is very interested in how we are talking about this today. Well, thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that very much, and I always appreciate you tuning in. So for me, leadership and management are distinct. They are two very different beasts, but they do complement each other, because effective management can control complexity, whereas effective leadership can produce useful change. And if you have effective leadership and good management, you've got a healthy organization. But I think, again, this means that you need that distinction in the organization between leadership and management. You need a very clear difference between the two. Otherwise, everything just gets a bit murky and people don't know where they stand.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. Happy reading.
Get set for the year ahead with the Bloomsbury Education Back to School sale. Save 30% on all Bloomsbury education books until 30th September. From the very best in research-led practice to trusted advice on inclusivity, behaviour and curriculum design, we've got something for everyone. Visit bloomsbury.com/B2S sale to shop now and save 30%. Bloomsbury Education, books for every step of your teaching journey.
So one of the other reasons that I think that distinction is really important is because effective management processes can go some way towards reducing those obstacles to leadership, those obstacles to effective leadership. So if we kind of see it as a hierarchy, we've got our followers who follow their leader, but the leaders themselves are then followers of managers. I think that's how I see it. Because effective management processes can reduce uncertainty. So if we take, for example, the scenario that I gave before about a 50% turnover in department, you're an effective leader, everybody was ready to be promoted, and so half of your staff went off to become heads of department themselves. If you have got an effective management process and your manager, as soon as those resignations have come in, your management says, right, okay, we're going to start the recruitment process so that we've got everything in place by the end of the summer term, then that can reduce that uncertainty for the leader, because the leader at least then knows, even if they haven't met the people, apart from around the interview, the leader at least then knows that the positions will have been filled going into the summer. Good management can provide stability. I will never forget a head and a deputy that I knew a few years ago, around similar age, because they were going to retire at a very similar time. And the head retired, and then, no, sorry, it was the other way around. The deputy retired, and the head went to retire a few years later. And I remember when the deputy announced her retirement, I said to her, oh, it's a good job you and the head weren't planning on going at the same time. And the deputy said to me, oh no, we've talked about this. We made sure that there would always be a couple of years between us to manage the deputy's successor. And so I think if an effective manager can have these open conversations with their own peers, their own colleagues, and can prioritize stability, that again can reduce that concern on the parts of the leaders, which in turn can make their leadership more effective. The managers, of course, have a wide range of responsibilities. They are the ones who are responsible for planning and budgeting, for organization and staffing, for controlling and problem solving. They've got the big picture in mind. And I think it's very important for managers to be successful leaders to their leadership team, so that the leadership team can work on much smaller things. Because as we know, the managers try and keep things stable, the managers strive for stability, whereas leaders strive for change. And in trying to shape then that culture, we've got the leader who is a role model. The leader should be the person you are looking up to. Your managers, you don't have to look up to necessarily, because they've got a different set of priorities to you. Your managers, remember, are the ones trying to keep everything the same. Whereas if you are a follower, perhaps you want to instigate some change. Perhaps you've read some research where X, Y, and Z is really interesting and I want to try that in my classroom. So your management can be a little bit more aloof. They can be a little bit more distant. As a leader, you're the one who has to be the role model. Leaders are responsible for coming up with a reward system. Now, obviously, at work, our reward system is that we get paid. It's why most of us go to work. But that doesn't need to be the only reward system in place. You know, if somebody is doing a good job, tell them that they are doing a good job. If you walk past somebody's classroom and they've got the door open and you stopped to listen for a couple of minutes because the way that they were teaching is really engaging, tell them that, because that's a reward system. Leaders have some responsibility for hiring decisions, not all, because that is ultimately down to management, but some. And they have some responsibility in structure and strategy, particularly within their own small domain. And all of those things lead to culture. And so this is why sometimes talking about the impact of leadership can be really difficult. And this is why, like I said before, as a leader, it can be really difficult to assess your own success. Because you are responsible as the leader for creating the norms. So everything that you are putting into place as the leader is stuff that just kind of starts being taken for granted as normal. And you can forget that it was put in place because of your actions. Now, unfortunately, and this again is why the idea of judging the efficacy of leadership against the actions of the followers is very difficult. The research shows us that outside environmental factors affect organizations more than leadership does. Internal structure and strategy determine the course of action that organizations take. So management tends to have more of an impact than leadership does. According to the different papers that I've read over this week, leadership accounts for only 7 to 15% of a follower's performance. Which is why, in my opinion, a leader can't be judged solely on the performance of their followers. See also why a teacher cannot be judged solely on the performance of their class in exams. So I think leaders realistically need to come up with their own parameters of measuring success. I think if you take a leadership role, which again, as I said at the top of the show, all of us who work with children in any capacity have. As a classroom teacher, you are a leader of your classroom. As a subject lead, you are a leader of that subject. As a children's TV presenter, you are a leader of the children who watch your show. So we all have leadership roles just by the nature of working with children. We need to think about what our own parameters of success are and figure out how we manage it that way. What is interesting, though, in business is that while leadership only accounts for a small amount of performance, it can account for a huge amount of profitability, up to 44%. Leadership can be responsible for up to 44% of a business's profitability, which is huge. And I guess it's because of those changes that are made, keeping on top of the research, knowing what's going on. Leadership is critical to orchestrate change, because the role of management is to keep things the same. And I think that, again, I emphasize that, but I think that's really important to remember. But the impact of leadership is moderated by situational factors, which again is exactly why leaders need to come up with their own definition of success to manage their own career trajectory, because there are too many outside factors for there to be any kind of objective, this is how you know you've succeeded. And that is us for today. I would like to thank everybody who has tuned in to listen this morning. I very, very much appreciate it. I hope you have enjoyed this shallow dive into leadership, this decoding of what leadership is. I hope that if you are in a position of leadership, you are able to find your parameters of success so that you know the impact that you are making, so that you know that you're doing a good job. And to those of you who are school leaders, whether you are a seasoned school leader or whether you're about to go into your first leadership position, good luck for the new academic year. I will be back next week. We will be talking about goal setting and resolutions, which I always try and do right at the beginning of the academic year. I'm going to look over the goals that I set myself this time last year and tell you all about how I didn't achieve any of them. And we're going to think about what goal setting for professional development, for career management looks like, so that we can start September off on a positive. Until then, have yourselves a great week. Do continue to tune in to Teachers Talk Radio. We've got lots of amazing shows ready for you over the week. And I look forward to having breakfast with you again next Saturday. Thank you very much and goodbye. He says, not able to scroll up to find his closing music. There we go. We will do that again. Thank you very much and goodbye.
You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live and listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.